in the second Cold War is that, while Kissinger and Nixon led the U.S. triangulation strategy in bringing China into this partnership against the Soviet Union, we are the ones who are now being triangulated. Increasingly concerned about the evolution of this deep-seated conflict that has now broken out into the open. In the last 5 years, we've gone from a trade war to a tech war and now a new Cold War. And as you alluded to in your introduction, in the last 4 months, starting with the balloon fiasco, things have gone from bad to worse. So I think we're at a very dangerous point in this conflict. And the book I've written really, I think, lays out, a good framework to think about this conflict. But most importantly, it ends with a few chapters on how to resolve it. And hopefully we'll get into that as we go through this discussion today.
Well, thank you so much for joining, and everybody, thanks for coming on. There's China and geopolitics has not made our top 5 most important impacts on the financial markets for quite some time, but we frequently talk about how it's on deck, and at any moment, you never know. Both with the hot war in Ukraine and this developing Cold War with China. And over the last several months, the tit for tats with China seem to be getting more and more serious. And Steve has written a book, which I could not recommend more highly. It's called Accidental Conflict: America, China, and the Clash of False Narratives. And Steve is probably the only person in the world that could have written a book like this. And that's because for a couple of decades leading up to his immersion into China, he laid the groundwork of his expertise as an economist in one of the most demanding environments of the world. And that was the strategy cockpit shared with Barton Biggs and Byron Wien. And they spent all their time talking to the most respected investors in the world. And it was that background in economics that gave him the entree. And given the importance and the entanglements of the U.S. and United States and China's economies as a connection for the Cold War, he's able to pull together a complexity of data and statistics that was impressive in the book, and not only come up with a clear strategy, but also lay it out so that it was understandable. But this book made me think more as I was reading it than many books in the past have. Markets Policy Partners publishes a newsletter every day, twice a day, and 3 times over the weekend, talking about financial markets and government policy as a blend, and that's why this fits so well into what we're doing. The peaceful economic and diplomatic relations between the 2 countries is really a key in continuing prosperity of China, US in particular, and the globe. I guess, Steve, the first thing I want to do is explain a little bit about how you got so connected into China as a second part of your career, and what happened, and then how that led to the creation of this book.
Well, Bob, I was, for most of my 30 years at Morgan Stanley, I was the chief economist and built a global economics team. We had a great team, but in the late 90s, during the Asian financial crisis, our great team sadly was clueless as to what this crisis meant for the region and the world. And, this disturbed me a lot. So I had a hunch, only a hunch, that China would hold the key to the end game of the Asian financial crisis. I had been to China several times, but they were basically drive-by visits, typical Wall Street, fly into Beijing or Shanghai in the morning, go to the other city in the afternoon, and then go on to Korea or somewhere else. So I didn't really feel that I knew China, but beginning in the second half of 97, I started going there for lengthy periods every other month. It quickly became evident to me that China was different. It was not going to go down the same sinkhole that was afflicting Thailand, Malaysia, South Korea, Taiwan, and the rest of the region. And so I started writing some very positive things about China. That got me some entree into pretty senior policy circles in China that really enabled me to deepen my insights and my conviction on the optimistic trajectory of China, not just during the Asian financial crisis of the late 90s, but for decades to come. And up until recently, where I have expressed greater concern than I have at any point in this 25-year journey as a China watcher. I've been probably the closest thing to a congenital bull on China and its role in the global economy. But, the subject of conflict with the US was a natural for me because, for the first half of my career at Morgan Stanley, I was focused on the US. In the second half, I focused on Asia and China in particular. And when I left Morgan Stanley about 12 years ago and went to Yale, I had to figure out what to teach. And I figured I could put those two strands of thought together and really focus on the intersection of the US and China. And, since I've been at Yale, I've written 2 books. This is my second book, and very focused on the US-China relationship and increasingly concerned about the evolution of this deep-seated conflict that is now broken out into the open. In the last 5 years, we've gone from a trade war to a tech war and now a new Cold War. And as you alluded to in your introduction, in the last 4 months, starting with the balloon fiasco, things have gone from bad to worse. So I think we're at a very dangerous point in this conflict. The book I've written really, I think, lays out, a good framework to think about this conflict. But most importantly, it ends with a few chapters on how to resolve it. And hopefully we'll get into that as we go through this discussion today.
I think that the way that you organize the book is actually the best way to talk about it, of course. Why don't we start with the historical context a little bit about the development of their economy and what were some of the distortions that are unique and long-term troublesome that feeds into the ultimate strategy?
Well, the miracle of Chinese development, 35 years of 10% growth, can clearly be traced to the leadership and vision of Deng Xiaoping, who was very pragmatic, still, very much a socialist and, very much beholden to, his Marxist ideological convictions. But nevertheless, after the Cultural Revolution, realized that China was in danger of becoming a failed state, and economic development was key to avoiding that. And so he did focus on rapid investment and export-led growth as the antidote to China's post-Cultural Revolution, post-Great Leap Forward, which preceded that, fragility. And boy, it sure worked. And it was powerful. And as I said, it delivered 3.5 decades of 10% growth, which is unprecedented in the annals of development for a large economy like China. But it was a flexible model too. And in 2007, and I focus a lot on this in this book, the former Premier Wen Jiabao raised an important critique of the Deng Xiaoping miracle and said that while growth is strong on the surface, beneath the surface, he was concerned because the economy was increasingly unstable, unbalanced, uncoordinated, and unsustainable. And, that gave rise to a pretty intense debate inside of China as to, how to address these concerns of the then premier. And the answer they came up with, which was, in retrospect, pretty straightforward, was to rebalance the structure of the economy away from exports and investment toward an economy that would be driven increasingly by internal private consumption. And that meant shifting away from manufacturing to services, and ultimately from imported technologies and innovation to more of a homegrown or indigenous innovation. It also meant that China needed to draw down its huge surplus of saving and put that saving to work in funding a social safety net that its aging middle-class society would need. So, Wen Jiabao figured this out, the leadership endorsed it, and I stayed, very optimistic on China after that. And it seemed to be working, not perfectly, but working well. And then in late 2012, the leadership transitioned to Xi Jinping, and his first year in office, again, I was very optimistic on China because under Xi's leadership, the government and the National People's Congress enacted this huge reform agenda that was enacted in late 2013, the so-called third plenum reforms, as they're called technically. And that was a very encouraging development. But then, it started to turn in a uncomfortable and ultimately unfortunate way, because the reforms that were enacted never got fully implemented. And instead, they were overwhelmed by Xi Jinping's political agenda, which initially focused on an anti-corruption campaign that quickly turned into power consolidation and a economic model that was much more constrained by ideology than was the case under the pragmatic approach, much less ideological, of Deng Xiaoping. And, it was in 2017, we're in a long and ponderous speech in front of the Politburo that Xi Jinping proclaimed that his approach, which he was not bashful at all about dubbing Xi Jinping thought, would be the guiding force shaping the aspirations of China for the foreseeable future. And at first, the optimists like me, and my optimistic colleagues inside of China dismiss this as sort of typical party speak. We felt that the Chinese economy was strong enough where they could walk and chew gum at the same time and remain in sync with their ideological roots, but still move to embrace and adopt these reforms. And the balance shifted, and the state, the role of the state, the importance of ideology is now paramount in shaping China, and that's much more problematic for the future than the optimists, and I put myself firmly in that camp previously, were anticipating.
Well, especially because the importance of developing the consumer and changing the mentality of savings into broadening out and spreading out the economy. I imagine that top-down pressure didn't help that trend at all. And that's one of the things that you point out has been a disappointment in how it was supposed to develop.
Yeah, the consumption story has been, widely discussed, and I have presented my views on this to Chinese officials for a number of years. Every year I participate in a big Davos-like extravaganza called the China Development Forum. And this year I gave, I think, 3 or 4 presentations in Beijing in March to the China Development Forum for 2023. And my second presentation was on the imperatives of consumer-led rebalancing. And I pointed out as I began that presentation that this year was the 8th year in the last 10 where I've given the same damn presentation. And I said, I'm prepared to do it for another 8 years, but it's been disappointing and frustrating that the progress hasn't been made. And in a nutshell, the story as I tell it is 3 building blocks to consumer demand in China. The first 2, they've done a great job, stimulating job creation and services and raising real wages through rural-urban migration. But the 4th leg, they just haven't tackled it, and that is taking the labor income that comes from job creation and real wage growth and converting it into discretionary consumption by investing in a social safety net, healthcare and retirement that give Chinese families, aging families, I might add, who are understandably concerned about the future, but giving those families the confidence to put their income to work in expanding their discretionary consumption. They haven't done that. The safety net reforms remain the missing link in the consumer-led rebalancing story. Again, I've stressed this repeatedly, year after year after year, and they sort of nod their head and say it's difficult, and that's a real problem.
Well, it's so ironic that in China the problem is a lack of confidence in the future that they might otherwise realistically change, that keeps them from spending and keeps them over saving. Whereas in the United States during this time, there's an overconfidence in the future and an addiction to spending. I'd love to quote your book because there was a paragraph in here that really summarized well. America's denial is deep. The public is highly uncomfortable with even the slightest hint that the U.S. may have to stop living beyond its means and face the possibility that China might no longer want to fund an overextended American lifestyle. The dirty little secret of Americans' penchant for living beyond its means is that the price of denial is cheap, underwritten by the confluence of exceptionally low interest rates and frothy asset markets, both of which have been underpinned by low inflation. The day will come, however, when these circumstances start to revert to a more normal state, which has coincided with these last several months of the tit for tat. And I'm curious with, why don't we move to some of the misconceptions and how they play into all this as we then move to the strategy of fixing it all?
Sure. Well, the few sentences that you just read, believe it or not, were crafted and recrafted multiple times. They're a very important summary of the connection between two economies that in many respects are the mirror image of one another. As you said, they save to excess and we dissave or don't save to excess. So what I was trying to say in that paragraph was that we've gotten away with it for really a series of reasons, but two in particular that bear on the problem at hand. One, that we're able to freely borrow surplus savings from abroad, from countries like China, Japan, and Germany. So we draw heavily on, what a former French president called the exorbitant privilege of the dollar, to borrow without any major consequences from those nations who run surpluses of their own. What I didn't say explicitly in that paragraph, but I had developed it earlier, is that the other piece of that puzzle is that we've been in a period of low inflation and extraordinarily accommodative monetary policy, and our central bank has really created huge incentives for us to draw on asset appreciation, both equities and for a long time bonds, to support our saving short lifestyle. And what I was concluding in that section is that the day will come sooner rather than later where the Fed will have to abandon its extraordinarily accommodative policies, and they're in the process of doing that right now, and where China will begin to think twice about directing its surplus toward dollar-based assets, and they're beginning to do that as well. And when that happens, then the U.S. economy is going to have an exceedingly difficult time in keeping the story going the way it has over the last couple of decades. And China is a very, very important part of that. The false narrative piece of that is that our shortfall of domestic savings, and I can give you the numbers, but I don't want to bore your viewers. But if you look at any measure of domestic saving, my preference is the depreciation adjusted net national savings rate, which is less than 2% of total national income right now. Lacking in saving and wanting to grow, we have no choice but to borrow surplus savings from abroad, again, from countries like China, Japan, Germany, and others to keep growing. But when we do that, we run enormous balance of payments deficits that give rise to a multilateral trade deficit. Last year, we had trade deficits with 106 countries in the United States. To a large extent, that's our fault, not their fault. If we saved more, we would not have to borrow so much from abroad and run these big current account and multilateral trade deficits. So, sure, we have a trade problem. China's the biggest piece of our trade deficit, but the trade deficit is very much of our own making as an outgrowth of our shortfall of domestic savings. That's not China's fault, that's our fault. And that's the false narrative that underpins so much of the China bashing that occurs now in the the halls of Congress, and has been for some time.
And another great irony is that Donald Trump came along and highlighted the blame being China, threw in some tariffs, and it wound up having the opposite effect. It didn't reduce the trade deficit. It shifted it.
Yeah, I mean, again, you go back to the theory that I just laid out. When you have a shortfall of savings and it doesn't go away, you can affect the distribution of trade by raising, the cost of goods purchased from one country through tariffs, as we did with China. But that will just divert the Chinese piece, and it did, to other foreign providers of surplus goods and capital. In this case, Vietnam, Indonesia, Mexico, Japan, Canada, and Germany. So, Trump's tariffs, despite his self-proclaimed brilliance of the strategy, completely backfired.
Should we talk about other misperceptions of the US, or should we shift to China?
Well, to me, the headline false narrative of America with respect to China is the chapter I wrote called "A Bilateral Bluster," where we fixate on allegations of unfair trading practices of China as the reason why American families and companies and communities are being damaged by trade. And the story I just took you through says that we need to accept greater responsibility for our trade deficits with China and another 105 other countries by addressing our savings problem. There are many, many more false narratives in the US with respect to China, but that's the one that I would draw to your attention. And, one of the big surprises to me in writing the book is I felt that it was very important to be balanced and fair in assessing this knack for running or for believing in false narratives. And, I found an equal number, if not larger number, of false narratives on the Chinese side in distorting the view of the United States and affecting their system. And the one I would highlight for you is one that is very topical and was articulated and embraced by Xi Jinping at the National People's Congress just a few months ago, in Beijing, where he stated for the first time that the U.S. policies of all-around encirclement, suppression, and containment were having a deleterious impact on Chinese development, and that the U.S. was the reason why China was experiencing growth problems. Well, like most false narratives, there are some facts that support the view. Yes, we are now, we've come out of the closet in embracing policies that do, in fact, that are, in fact, aimed at containing China. And we used to deny this. We don't do that anymore in light of the sanctions, for example, we put on advanced semiconductors last October. This is directly aimed at the major innovations that we and the Chinese view as central to their prospective growth and development. But, the false narrative is that Xi Jinping now argues that these actions of geostrategic containment that we are taking with respect to China are the reason why there's a growth problem in China. And China's growth problem is very much of its own doing. It reflects the lack of reforms in the safety net area that I described earlier. It reflects the demography of an aging society where the working age population is now contracting. And most importantly, it reflects the fact that Chinese productivity growth has now gone negative for the last decade and is likely to continue to be weak for years to come. These are China's problems. These are not our problems. And so their false narrative is very comparable to ours, identifying a critical problem, but blaming it on us when they really have no one to blame except themselves.
How connected is the productivity issue with the with Xi's clampdown on I'll call it clampdown on free enterprise, but it was the imposition of the state into a lot of the companies and corporate activities over the last, I don't know, maybe when did it start? 5 or 6
2 years ago.
Yeah, but it felt like it went back a little farther than that. But is there a connection there, or where is that being manifested in economic data?
There's a very tight connection. The numbers on total factor productivity is that the growth rate has been negative to the tune of an average of 1.4% a year over the last 9 years that we have data for. That's terrible. And many believe, and I certainly endorse this, that decline is very much a function of Xi Jinping's renewed emphasis on state-owned enterprises as a driver of economic activity. State-owned enterprises, or SOEs as we refer to them in China, are notorious for low returns, high costs, and producing severe headwinds to overall productivity. And Xi Jinping has certainly thrown his support to the support of these SOEs really since early in his first 5 years of his first term in office. Looking forward, there's no reason to believe that he's backing away from the emphasis on SOEs. And moreover, as you alluded to, Bob, the regulatory constraints that have been imposed on the once very dynamic private sector, especially the internet platform companies, look likely to remain in place, and that will be a prospective headwind for productivity that reinforces the earlier one, still in place, from shifting the pendulum of economic power back to these ossified state-owned enterprises. And that's a real problem. It takes me back to my comments that I made to the China Development Forum a couple of months ago in Beijing. My third presentation was for, quote, an academic roundtable of trying to understand and grapple with the factors driving the growth debate in China over the medium to longer term. And I said that, look, as the sort of longstanding foreign optimist on China, my view has changed because of the intersection between the decline of the working age population and the productivity story. And I pointed out to them that China is not unique in this regard. This is a story that has played out with a vengeance now for 3 decades in Japan. And the Japanese working age population curve peaked about 18 years before that in China, and their productivity quagmire it's different, but it's very deep, and has been so in Japan for a number of years. And I asked the rhetorical question. I said, if you stay the course, aren't you at risk of becoming the next Japan? And that was sort of an uncomfortable subject to breach, in a big Chinese forum, but it did spark a lot of debate and pushback from the Chinese academics who participated in that session.
I'll bet it did. Nothing like tossing a hand grenade onto the table.
Well, it was pretty much on the table.
We've covered a lot of the economic aspects of the book. There was a diplomatic aspect of the book that you touched on that also resonated, and it was the triangulation gambit that you described. And you brought Henry Kissinger's view a generation ago about his opening up with Nixon, the relationship with China. I think that's probably worth discussing, if you don't mind.
Sure. What I pointed out was, as we now enter arguably a Cold War, there are some who don't believe that, but I believe, as does Kissinger, by the way, that we are in a Cold War. And by the way, in the current issue of The Economist, they have a summary of an in-depth interview they had with Kissinger last month, and he said that the two superpowers who are now in a Cold War have basically 5 to 10 years to figure things out, or the odds of a hot war are likely to rise materially. And I take that as a very ominous and well thought out conclusion. But if you go back to the first Cold War, one of the most decisive moments came when Nixon and Kissinger went to China and established the beginnings of a relationship that turned into a partnership that did lead to this triangulation strategy against the former Soviet Union, isolated the Soviets, and created a very difficult economic climate that ultimately brought the Soviet economy down hard in the late 1980s and early 1990s, that many Cold War scholars believe was the most decisive blow in this first Cold War, the economic implosion of the former Soviet Union. And, the point I made in this second Cold War is that, while Kissinger and Nixon led the US triangulation strategy in bringing China into this partnership against the Soviet Union, we are the ones who are now being triangulated because China on February 4th of last year signed an unlimited partnership with the Russian Federation, and the two nations together are really joining in a partnership that is directly aimed at countering the influence of the United States. And so, the Chinese, I think, have studied this geostrategic triangulation gambit very carefully, and given the deepening conflict that had been building with the US and their prospects for a continuation of that conflict, they went back to this earlier triangulation strategy as a way to address the growing threat of containment being posed by the United States.
Yeah, it was a really key part of the book, I thought. And why don't we move to the really easy part, which is fixing all this?
Sure. Well, yeah, this is a book about conflict. It's depressing in many respects, but I really felt that it was critical to end the book on a constructive note as opposed to a pessimistic note, a note that was mindful of the risks of conflict escalation and the consequences of where that would go if we didn't address it. But the question I always got, on Wall Street is the one I always ask myself, and that is that, if you're so smart in identifying a problem, how about giving us the solution? So I just go back. The first part of the book focuses on the relationship aspects of this conflict. I argue very strongly that, contrary to what we have embraced in our media, America does not have a China problem. And I also argue that, contrary to what the Chinese leadership and the state-controlled media says in China, China does not have an America problem. The two of us together have a relationship problem. And so, in thinking about conflict resolution, my focus is on sort of a framework that requires mutual commitment to addressing a relationship problem. And so briefly, I recommend three things. The first is most obvious, and that is restoring trust. There is no trust between our two nations. And it's very difficult when the distrust is deepened to just wave a wand and say, let's play a trust game. It doesn't work that way. So there are some easy things to do, and there are some not so easy things to do, and there's some really tough things to do. And I talk about all of them in the first chapter of this final part. The easy ones being reopening closed consulates in both countries, restarting popular and successful student foreign exchange programs, relaxing visa requirements. Tougher to do, but very important is relaxing constraints on non-governmental organizations like NGOs to bring civil society back into the trust equation. And then finally, tackling the really tough existential issues that affect both the US and China and the world, like climate, global health, cybersecurity. We're not going to do all of those in any semblance of time that I can envision. But if we make progress, especially in the low-hanging fruit, then I think we can go on into the other two aspects of the plan. The second one is to focus on pro-growth initiatives by lowering investment barriers in both nations through coming to an agreement on what's called a bilateral investment treaty. We have over 40 of them in place right now. The Chinese have over 100 in place right now. These are inherently pro-growth, and we were about 95% of the way done completing negotiations on one in 2016. And then Trump came into office and pulled it off the table. We should go back to finishing those negotiations as soon as possible. And then thirdly, and this is the final leg of the stool that I'm actually the most excited about, because I haven't seen it really addressed anywhere else, and that is I've got a proposal for what I call a USChina Secretariat, a new organization that really embodies a very different approach to building a permanent architecture of engagement between our two countries. The USChina Secretariat is a permanent organization staffed equally by large complements of American and Chinese professionals. Call them technocrats if you want, but they have a broad remit to work 24/7 on all aspects of the relationship, from economics and trade to technology to innovation policy, to the role of the state in supporting subsidized activities in both nations, to tackling these existential issues that I just mentioned, climate, health, cyber, even human rights, which is so important in the United States. And the Secretary would be empowered to write policy white papers to address these issues. They would have a convening authority to bring in experts that are outside the staff of the Secretariat to tackle tough issues. The classic example there is COVID-19. We've been, I think, disappointingly focused on turning the pandemic into political theater, when under a Secretariat, we could have brought together leading scientists, epidemiologists, public health practitioners to really tackle this horrific pandemic before it got out of hand as it did in 2020. And then finally, the Secretariat would be empowered to monitor existing and new agreements and have a dispute resolution function to screen the inevitable frictions that would arise in any of these agreements if they had with respect to China's membership in the World Trade Organization and through implementation of a new agreement like a bilateral investment treaty. We have no real structure of engagement. Biden says, oh, things are going to get better because I'm going to pick up the phone and call my old buddy Xi Jinping. I don't want to personalize engagement. It is not an approach that I think has worked well over the years and won't work well in getting us out of conflict. We need a deeper, more permanent institutionalization of the engagement, and the Secretariat offers that. One final note on the failed framework of engagement. Earlier this year, when we shot the balloon down, the Chinese were appalled, and we were concerned about the blowback. So on February 4th, U.S. Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin picked up the secure phone that he has in the Pentagon to call his counterpart in China, and the Chinese defense minister did not answer the phone. We can't afford that type of slipshod, failed engagement ever again. And so the Secretariat would offer, I think, a much more secure, trust-based, robust capacity for communication on these and other issues. And I strongly endorse that and write about that in detail in the final chapter of the book. So that's my plan, Bob. Relationship-based, rebuilding trust, lowering investment barriers, and setting up a new architecture for bilateral engagement. It may not be perfect, but it sure as heck beats what we've got now. Which is
any plan is better than no plan. Out of curiosity, how does national security issues, how do national security issues interact with the Secretariat at all? Do you?
They have to.
Yeah,
They have to.
I was going to say at some point there would be a time under pressure if the relationships were souring, that they would intrude anyway, even if they weren't going to be there.
Look, national security is the big elephant in the room right now for both nations. Jake Sullivan, our national security advisor, came out with a speech in September of last year where he stated unequivocally that national security for the U.S. Is more important than economic security in shaping our relationship with China. And literally a month later, Xi Jinping said the same thing at the so-called 20th Party Congress, stressing security, security, security as being the single most important concern that he has with respect to China. So both nations prioritizing security have really changed the dynamic of a relationship that up until then had long been anchored by economics and trade. So, a secretariat that is empowered to deal with relationship problems has to be very cognizant of this security emphasis on both sides of the relationship.
Is there any move afoot for this to occur? Do you know?
I'm pushing it hard, Bob.
Yeah.
And I'm looking for endorsements I'll send a markets policy partners, a form that you can sign in lieu of compensation
Please do.
for this webinar.
Please
But
do.
I've written about it. It's in my book. I have several articles coming out in detail about that shortly. I will tell you, in the interest of full disclosure, I have presented this view in Beijing. And, while they are reluctant to offer enthusiastic endorsement of anything coming from an American, they're interested in. They have listened, I would say, politely, and offered some critical suggestions that would tweak some aspects of this, but they're certainly interested in proposals that could lead to a more constructive way of engagement. And I would just add that I've made the same presentation to politicians and officials in our country, and the virtually unanimous reaction can be summarized as, "You've got to be kidding." There's no interest right now in engagement with from the U.S. government's point of view. The sentiment in the U.S. Congress right now is as negative toward China as it has been at any point in the history of the relationship. And the business community is afraid to speak out, and the public opinion is at risk of being poisoned. So we need to figure out a better way to engage, and I think a secretariat would be an important step in that direction.
Well, you do a good job in the book of pointing out the relative position of the United States economy and how much relatively stronger it was in decades past, and that we seem to be operating on the belief that that won't change. Yet there's plenty of evidence that would suggest that the amount of total national debt that's been accumulated over the last decade would suggest that we have some wood to chop at home before we can flex our muscles elsewhere.
Well, I draw that out in a chapter that focuses on a comparison between the first Cold War and the second Cold War. And the false narrative from the US side is that just because we defeated the former Soviet Union in the first Cold War, we're going to do the same thing in the second Cold War against China. And I point out, two things. One, the Chinese economy is much bigger and much stronger than the former Soviet economy was at any point during the first Cold War. And secondly, our economic performance, as you just alluded to, whether it's from the standpoint of productivity growth, domestic savings, current account, and trade deficits, is a good deal weaker today than it was in the first Cold War. So we got to be pretty careful in being smug in just concluding that just because we won the first Cold War, there's reason to think that we'll do the same the second time around.
Well, I think the Secretariat idea also would certainly address your first component of trust building, because it would undoubtedly be populated with a breadth of people and a depth of people whereby it would be easiest to find common ground and develop relationships and trust on those as the foundation.
Yeah, and when two large groups of officials, experts, technocrats come to work each day in the same building, that builds a sense of comfort and familiarity that can sow the seeds of trust building at a very important level as well. So the organization that I envision is one that focuses on collaborative engagement between these two teams rather than siloed existence. I don't want a Chinese floor and an American floor. I want them to work in a commingled functionality, and I lay that out in the book as well.
What's the ideal location for this building?
A neutral venue. Call it Switzerland, call it Singapore. Pick your neutral place. I don't want it in Washington or Beijing.
Mm-hmm. Well, Steve, this has been terrific. Thank you very much. Any thoughts about the most recent things about the U.S. economy or the markets that are related to any of this that are worth people knowing about?
Well, you do. Your team does a great job in fleshing out the economic and market debate, and I think we've explored a key risk factor in that debate. As you pointed out at the outset, from time to time, it has an impact on market sentiment, but has not really been a critical driver. But I think as this conflict deepens, and especially in light of the developments since early February with the balloon, you just can't afford to ignore this as a potentially major risk to markets that have been, I think, resilient, but you could also say complacent in light of this constellation of forces that's building around the world.
I guess it was implied when Kissinger suggested 5 to 10 years, we could turn it into a hot war, that Taiwan being invaded is not something that he would anticipate within that time frame, right? Because that would be the hot war, I assume.
Well, if there is a move on the part of China to execute a military action in Taiwan, that would obviously shorten the time frame. He does not believe, and I would share this view, that China has any desire to turn this into a premature military conflict, despite all the convictions that you hear from the China hawks in our country. But the U.S. is sort of, in many respects, with respect to Taiwan, been really aggressive in putting its foot on China's throat. We've had the Pelosi visit. We've had McCarthy's sort of transit visit with the Taiwanese president, who made a transit visit to the U.S. I stated that incorrectly. There's been, big allocation of military funding that was signed into law late last year as part of the Defense Appropriations Act that would direct at least another $10 billion of military support to Taiwan. We've had, I'd say, a number of statements from the administration and certainly from the U.S. Congress that are very pro-Taiwanese independence. And, we talk about red lines. We have our share of red lines. They have their share of red lines. And, we're really pushing very close to one of China's biggest red lines as we continue to intensify the pressure on China with respect to this issue. And if we're not careful, that could backfire and force a premature military move by the United States, which would I think, be catastrophic in terms of its implications for the relationship and for the world.
Indeed. Well, Steve, thank you very much. It was great to have you on and get into your work. That must have been quite a project.
Yeah, you work a long time on these books, and you never know what the world's going to look like when they come out. But I think timing is everything, and to have a book on conflict escalation coming out at a point when the conflict has in fact escalated to a dangerous level, I think the book is well timed to address an exceedingly important and topical issue.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to address that. And I would
thank you, Steve, and
urge your listeners to go out and get a copy of Accidental Conflict. It's your favorite, internet-based publishing platform.
Steve, great to see you. Thank you.
Thank you, Bob.